The second chapter we'll be studying this semester is the chapter on learning, chapter 7, and that will be followed by the chapter on memory, chapter 8. So these two chapters may provide some practical tools and skills to help you learn and remember. So there are some videos embedded in the PowerPoint here. There'll be assignments. You go to assignments, just submit the assignment, and we'll be talking about some of these videos in our discussions. So be sure that you watch each of the videos. You'll notice also that some slides do not have an audio component. On those slides, just read what is on the slide. My audio would be nothing more than what is written on those particular slides. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, contact me with questions. Don't hesitate. This slide and the next two slides are a summary of the chapter. And so the chapter discusses how we learn. So we learn in three basic ways: through classical conditioning, through operant conditioning, and by way of observation. Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior due to an organism's experience. So learning makes us more flexible than the genetically programmed or instinctual behaviors of the Chinook salmon or the sea turtles, who when they emerge from the sand at birth know to directly head toward the ocean. They don't need to be taught. And so if we learn behavior, we're flexible. If we can learn, we can also then unlearn. If we learn a dysfunctional behavior, we can learn to become more functional. So we can learn to adapt to any environment. So by way of learning, we're adaptable and we can cope to changing situations. So we can change, and this underlines the philosophy of therapy and rehabilitation. So no matter how hard or bad life gets, we have the capacity to change. Okay, sometimes that involves changing our coping mechanisms and our attitudes. So we learn by association, and there are two types of associational learning: classical and operant conditioning. Conditioning means learning, so classical and operant learning. We also learn by observation. So we'll start with association. A baby, let's say, sees, smells, and eats its very first bowl of cereal and really likes it. So the next time the baby smells the hot cereal, it gets excited even before it eats the cereal, because the baby is anticipating a good eating experience. So this is anticipatory learning or associational learning, a good example of classical conditioning. So we link or associate events close together. We hear the screech of brakes and we look out for a possible accident or danger. The psychologist tells a story of his cat. His cat wants to go outside around 3 a.m. every morning. The cat wakes him up. So he began putting the cat out at bedtime. And so the cat then begins to hide. So one night he opens a can of soup and the cat comes running into the kitchen. So why might that be? Right, the cat associates the sound of the can opener with a good eating experience. So each night before the psychologist goes to bed, he pushes or runs the can opener, the cat runs into the kitchen, and he puts the cat outside. Okay, So an example of associational learning, classical conditioning. On this slide, you see another example of associative learning, in this case, classical conditioning. So a researcher sprays a sea snail with water and then shocks the sea snail. Okay, so pretty soon, and the sea snail then flinches. And so the researcher does this a few times, and eventually squirting the snail with water results in a flinch because the sea snail has associated a spray of water with a shock. You see another example of associative learning on this slide. Your textbook talks about a Japanese researcher who worked with quail. So before presenting a mateable female quail to a male quail, the researcher flashed a red light. So eventually the red light alone aroused the male bird. Another example of associative learning or classical conditioning. The second type of associative learning involves learning to associate a response with a consequence, and this is operant conditioning. So you see on the slide, the seal is bouncing a ball on its nose, and when the seal does this, the consequence is getting a fish. So in being rewarded and having a positive consequence for bouncing the ball, the seal is more apt to bounce the ball on its nose. So it increases the frequency of ball bouncing. So operant conditioning, a type of associative learning, involves learning to associate a response with a consequence. So we avoid acts that bring bad results or consequences, and we engage in acts that we associate with positive consequences. So a young child puts a metal fork in an outlet and it gets a bad shock, and so it associates putting the fork with something bad, and hopefully the infant ceases to do that. Now I'm going to talk about classical conditioning in this slide and the next few slides in more detail. So does the name Ivan Pavlov ring a bell? Okay, Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who accidentally discovered classical conditioning. He was actually studying digestion in dogs, and he was measuring dog salivation in test tubes. He attached a test tube to the mouth of a dog, as you see on the slide. So when he put meat powder on a dog's tongue, the dog would salivate. So he noticed that the dog would start to salivate even before he put the meat on the dog's tongue. Just seeing the meat led to salivation. Eventually, he noticed that the dog salivated as he heard Pavlov's footsteps coming down the hall to the laboratory. So the dog associated Pavlov and even the sound of Pavlov with a good eating experience. So associational learning. So Pavlov's work provided a basis for behaviorists like John Watson, who I'll talk about in a bit. So before conditioning or learning, food naturally produces salivation. So we call the food an unconditioned stimulus, an unlearned stimulus, a US. So the food produces salivation, and salivation is an unlearned response. So it's a UR, an unconditioned response. Now you see a tuning fork on the slide. That's what Pavlov used back in his day to create a sound. Most people, when they talk about Pavlov, talk about ringing a bell, pretty much the same thing. So the tone, if you rang a bell in front of your dog, probably the dog definitely isn't going to salivate, but probably isn't going to respond. So the tone is considered, before conditioning, a neutral stimulus, or an NS. Okay. So during conditioning or learning, the neutral stimulus, in this case the tone, and the food, the unconditioned stimulus, are paired. So Pavlov sounded the tone, then showed the dog food, and the dog salivated. Okay, he did this a number of times, sounded the tone, and paired it shortly thereafter with food. So after conditioning, after learning, after he did this a few times, the neutral stimulus is now considered the conditioned stimulus, or the learned stimulus. The dog now salivates to the bell or to the sound of the tone. So he's made an association between the sound of the tone and a good eating experience. So the tone alone, or the bell, is a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation is a learned response, or a conditioned response. So after conditioning, the salivation is called a conditioned response. Classical conditioning is biologically adaptive. It helps us prepare for good or bad events. So, as I said earlier, we hear brakes screeching and we prepare to look quickly and brace ourselves, to put on the brake, to blow the horn, swerve, whatever we need to do to avert an accident. We hear thunder, we prepare for a storm. A deer in the forest hears a twig snap, and he or she prepares for a predator. So, the first of the 5 major conditioning processes is acquisition. This is the initial learning of the SR relationship, the stimulus-response relationship. Okay, so the organism develops an association between a neutral stimulus, the bell or the tone, and an unconditioned stimulus, the food. In most cases, for conditioning to occur, the neutral stimulus needs to come before the unconditioned stimulus. So Pavlov rang the bell, okay, and shortly thereafter presents the food. So the time should be about a half a second between the two pairings. Your textbook uses the example of a passionate kiss paired with onion breath to explain the acquisition process. So again, Pavlov said the CS needs to come a half a second before the US in order for learning or acquisition to occur. So someone gets a passionate kiss, it leads to arousal. So the kiss is the unconditioned stimulus, and the unlearned or the unconditioned response is arousal. So then the experimenter pairs onion breath, okay, the conditioned stimulus, with a passionate kiss, the unconditioned stimulus, and arousal occurs, the UR occurs. So this is done a few times, and the person associates onion breath with arousal. So the onion breath is the conditioned stimulus, that leads to arousal, which in this case is considered to be the learned response or the conditioned response. The second major process is called extinction. So when food doesn't follow the tone, when the unconditioned stimulus does not follow the conditioned stimulus, salivation, the conditioned response, begins to decrease, and you see that on the graph, and eventually it extinguishes, it stops. Okay, so we see the strength of the stimulus increase during acquisition, and then when we keep ringing the bell without giving meat after sounding the tone or the bell, we see a decrease until the response is extinct. The third major process is called spontaneous recovery. So after extinction, Pavlov would give the dog a rest period. And then he would bring the dog back into the lab, and the dog would begin to salivate again to the tone. And so we call this spontaneous recovery. So if you look at the graph, you see spontaneous recovery occurs. The dog starts salivating, but not as strongly as the dog salivated during the height of acquisition. Now, if the tone persists by itself without the meat, the conditioned response becomes extinct once again. One more thing about spontaneous recovery before I move on to stimulus generalization is that not only is the response weaker, but it's shorter in duration. So the dog salivates for a shorter period of time. In the example of onion breath and arousal, the arousal in spontaneous recovery would not be as intense. And so we move on to the next process, stimulus generalization. So this is the tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. Okay, so Pavlov conditioned the dog's salivation by using miniature vibrators on the thigh. Okay, when he subsequently stimulated other parts of the body, salivation stopped. Okay, so you can see this on the graph. So the closer the stimulation was to the thigh, okay, the stronger the response. Now let's say you condition your dog to salivate to middle C on the piano. So you play middle C, you give your dog a treat. Okay, you do this several times, and then you've conditioned your dog. You press middle C, and the dog salivates. Now, if you played B, what might happen? Yeah, the dog salivates because the tone is similar to the original tone. You play D, your dog is likely to salivate to D. But the farther the tone is from C, let's say F or G, the less likely the dog is to salivate, okay? Because the dog can distinguish between C and F or G. So we talk about stimulus generalization, and this can be valuable in everyday life. So kids are taught to fear moving cars in the street. And so we want this to generalize to all moving things in the street, trucks, buses, bicycles, motorcycles, etc. Now, stimulus generalization can be detrimental. If bitten by a dog, for example, in some cases, the fear generalizes to all dogs. We could look at prejudice as an example of stimulus generalization. A person could have one negative experience with someone from a different race or ethnicity and then generalize that to all people. So I want you to think of examples of stimulus generalization in your own life. So generalization can be helpful, but discrimination is also helpful. And so I talked on the last slide a bit about discrimination, the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that don't signal an unconditioned stimulus. So in real life, we learn to distinguish a harsh tone from a praising tone of voice in our parents. We learn to distinguish a friendly expression from a threatening expression. Early biologists like Pavlov and Watson believed that the laws of learning were similar for all organisms. But later, researchers found that learning is constrained by an animal's biology. Now, John Garcia, who you see in this slide, studied the effects of radiation on lab animals. He noticed that rats began avoiding drinking water from plastic bottles that were in radiation chambers. So he wondered what this was about. He wondered if the rats associated the plastic tasting water, the conditioned stimulus, with sickness or nausea that's caused by radiation. So originally, the radiation would be considered an unconditioned stimulus, an unlearned stimulus, which produces nausea, an unconditioned response. And then when it's paired with water, the water eventually becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the water alone can induce nausea. It's a conditioned response. So Garcia gave rats a particular taste and then hours later radiated them. Okay, so even if sickened hours after tasting a particular flavor, they avoided that flavor. So this contradicted Pavlov's idea that the unconditioned stimulus must follow the conditioned stimulus by 1/2 second. Rats develop aversions to taste, as Garcia showed, but not to sights or sounds. And this contradicted Pavlov's idea that any stimulus could serve as a conditioned stimulus. And this makes adaptive sense. So we learn more readily to fear snakes and spiders rather than fear flowers or grass. This is adaptive. So this supports Darwin's theory of natural selection. Garcia's findings stimulated research with other species. Okay, in one study, coyotes and wolves who were threatening sheep populations were tempted to eat sheep carcasses that were laced with a sickening poison. And the coyotes and wolves developed an aversion to sheep meat. So this is classical conditioning. Two wolves, later penned with a live sheep, actually cowered in the corner, fearing the sheep. So this kind of research suggests humane ways for controlling predators and agricultural pests. And there are numerous examples of the application of classical conditioning. So a homework assignment is to think of some other applications of classical conditioning and bring these to class discussion. So you see on the slide, drug users need to avoid triggers or cues. Sometimes it's the people they used to use with, the places. It could even be the person's car, where they got high, anything they associate with previous drug use. Okay. Through classical conditioning, a drug plus its taste that affects the immune response may cause the taste of the drug to actually invoke the immune response. So a homework assignment is posted on pages, Healing Without Drugs. And there's a good example of this in that article. This is a real-life situation using classical conditioning to help someone with a serious disease. So Watson, as you know, classically conditioned little Albert to fear white rabbits, and his fear then generalized to anything white and furry. Now, Watson lost his position as a professor, and he went to work as an advertiser. He worked for an advertising firm, and he employed the principles of classical conditioning. And so the term coffee break was one that he coined. He was advertising Maxwell House coffee, and people associated Maxwell House with the term coffee break. In classical conditioning, we form associations between stimuli. In this case, the sea snail associates a splash of water with an aversive shock. In operant conditioning, we form an association between a behavior and what happens after the behavior, the consequence. So the seal balances the ball on its nose, and the resulting event is getting a fish, a reward. So the seal then is more apt to balance the ball on its nose once again. Skinner is the best known behaviorist. He did a lot of work on operant conditioning. Skinner's work extends Thorndike's thinking on learning, especially his law of effect. So Thorndike investigated what he called trial and error learning with cats, dogs, chickens, and monkeys. And in his best known experiment, he placed a hungry cat in a wooden box with slats, and he called this box a puzzle box. And if the cat pulled a lever, he could escape and find a reward of food that he could see right outside the box. So initially, the cat would try to squeeze through the box. It would scratch, bite, claw inside the box. And eventually, the cat would accidentally trip the mechanism and open the door. So each time after winning freedom and getting a reward of food, the cat was returned to the box. And after many trials, the cat learned through trial and error how to open the door immediately after being placed in the box. Shaping is an operant conditioning procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior towards the desired target behavior through successive approximations. So Skinner did a lot of work with shaping. He shaped pigeons. He would shape a pigeon to turn in a circle. So let's say as he's starting to shape, as the pigeon turns in the direction that Skinner wanted the pigeon to turn, he would give the pigeon a pellet of food. And he would do this a couple of times, each time the pigeon turned in the appropriate direction. And then he would wait until the pigeon moved even further in the shape of a circle and then reinforce that behavior. So he would do that a couple of times, and then he would wait until the pigeon actually moved farther along in the shape of a circle and would reinforce that behavior. So this is shaping. If you had a child, you could shape a child to toilet train. So let's say your child indicates that he or she needs to use the bathroom, and the child doesn't make it to the bathroom, but the child told you, so you reinforce that. You praise the child or give them a treat and tell them how wonderful it was they let you know. And so you might do that a couple of times, but then the child doesn't get rewarded until the child actually goes into the bathroom, okay, etc. So reinforcement is any event that strengthens the behavior it follows. The example on the slide shows that when the meerkat stands on its hind feet, it gets rewarded with a heat lamp to warm it up in the cold weather. So what you're doing in positive reinforcement is adding a wanted or a desirable stimulus. So getting a hug, receiving a paycheck, getting an allowance, positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement also strengthens a response. So what we do in negative reinforcement is remove something aversive. So we get in our car, we start to drive away, and we hear the beeping in the car because we haven't fastened the seatbelt. So when we plug the seatbelt in, the aversive beeping stops. Okay, you have a headache. You take an aspirin, the aspirin takes the pain away. That's negative reinforcement. The aspirin removes the aversive headache. So the goal of positive reinforcement is to increase a wanted behavior. Immediate and delayed reinforcers. An immediate reinforcer is a reinforcer that occurs instantly after a behavior. So a rat gets a food pellet when it presses a bar. Delayed reinforcer is a reinforcer that is delayed in time after a certain behavior occurs. So a paycheck that comes at the end of the week or every 2 weeks, that would be considered a delayed reinforcer. So humans, unlike animals, respond to delayed reinforcers. A good grade at the end of the semester, for example. People are willing to, let's say, not go out every time they're invited to go out with friends so that they can do their homework and study to get a good grade. People will discipline themselves to work hard at a sport so that they have the honor of doing well at the end of a season. There's an experiment which you'll see in a film, the famous marshmallow experiment done by Walter Mischel, in which 4-year-olds could get a small treat today. They were given a marshmallow, or if they waited, they could get 2 when the experimenter returned. Those who chose the delayed gratification of a larger treat 2 marshmallows, scored higher on tests of social competency and maturity than kids who chose to immediately gratify themselves. Longitudinal studies have shown children who delay gratification tend to become high-achieving adults and socially competent adults. When Skinner originally worked with pigeons and other animals, he would use continuous reinforcement. So he would reinforce the desired response each time it occurred. But what he noticed is that when he stopped reinforcing, the behavior quickly went away, it extinguished. So he began to experiment with different types of partial reinforcement. So in partial reinforcement, we reinforce a response only every so often. So this results in slower acquisition of the behavior we want to see, but it shows greater resistance to extinction later on. So gambling in a gambling casino, okay, the old slot machines, the gambler would win unpredictably and occasionally. So they kept trying because gambling essentially is putting a person on a partial reinforcement schedule. Skinner says that there are 2 types of partial reinforcement schedules. The first type is a ratio schedule. When we talk about a ratio schedule, we're concerned with numbers of responses. So there are 2 types of ratio schedules, fixed and variable. So in a fixed ratio schedule, we reinforce a response after a specified number of responses. So piecework pay is an example. This is now illegal, but people used to work on assembly lines and they would get paid per piece of work that they did. And so as you can imagine, that produced very high rates of responses so that people could make more money the faster they worked. But this resulted in injury and in illness, and eventually it was made illegal. So a fixed ratio schedule is sometimes called an FR schedule. So if we had an FR2 schedule, we would reinforce a behavior every 2 times that behavior occurred. An FR schedule, we'd reinforce after every 9 behaviors. A variable ratio schedule reinforces a response after an unpredictable number of responses. So this is very hard to extinguish because it's so unpredictable. So back to the example of gambling. The gambler never knows when he or she is going to win, so they keep gambling their money. Okay, fishing, fly fishing in particular. Never know when a fish is going to bite, and so the fisherman or fisherwoman keeps casting its line. So it keeps the person trying. It's hard to extinguish. So, this can be a negative thing. The child doesn't know how many times asking for something will get the response he or she wants. So the child is persistent. So I've seen this in toy stores over the years. A child will ask for a high-priced item, then another high-priced item, and then they go to the checkout aisle and they ask for something that isn't very expensive, and the parent allows the child to have the less expensive item. So the parent isn't consistent. The child doesn't know when the parent will give in, so they keep asking. So a variable ratio schedule. There are more examples in your textbook. Interval schedules are based on time. So two types of interval schedules, fixed and variable. So a fixed interval schedule reinforces a response only after a specified time has elapsed. So you have a paper due every 3 weeks. You may not do work until right before the paper is due. Okay, the mailman comes usually around 3 p.m. So you check a lot right before and maybe even right after 3 o'clock. So a fixed interval schedule produces moderate response rates with spurts of activity mixed with spurts of inactivity. A variable interval schedule reinforces a response at unpredictable time intervals. So your professor says all semester you'll have pop quizzes. So this usually results in slow, steady response rates. The students study on a regular basis because they never know when they'll have a quiz. So a variable interval schedule rewards persistence. After you have studied the schedules of reinforcement, go to Pages and complete the homework assignment and bring it to class discussion. We'll go over it then. The purpose of this assignment is to test your understanding of the various schedules of reinforcement. The goal of punishment is the opposite of the goal of reinforcement. The goal of punishment is to decrease the frequency of an unwanted behavior. Okay, so the slide says it's an aversive event that decreases the behavior it follows. And so the slide shows you that there are two types of punishment: positive punishment and negative punishment. In positive punishment, we administer an aversive stimulus. So a spanking would be a positive punishment. Okay, a parking ticket, okay, a speeding ticket. You're given something that you don't want in order to decrease that behavior, to decrease speeding, to decrease parking in an illegal spot. Negative punishment has the same goal, to decrease an unwanted behavior. So someone withdraws a desirable stimulus. So time out is an excellent example of a negative punishment. Okay. Something you like to do, for example, hang out with your friends, is taken away. Or a small child has to sit in a chair in the corner of the room for a certain amount of time and can't engage with other kids or toys. So time out. Okay, you get your driver's license revoked. Okay, any kind of privileges revoked. That would be negative punishment. So the overall goal of punishment is to decrease unwanted behaviors. Skinner discounted the importance of cognitive processes and biological underpinnings in operant conditioning. But evidence of cognitive processes during operant learning comes from rats during a maze exploration, in which they navigate the maze without an obvious reward. So it seems that rats develop cognitive maps, or mental representations of the layout of a maze. We can learn without reinforcement. There's more to learning than just associating a response with a consequence. We have the ability to develop cognitive maps. So rats may learn to run a maze, but the learning only becomes apparent when there's an incentive or a reward. Kids may learn from observing a parent, but demonstrate the learning later when needed. So latent learning. Psychologists talk about two types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. In intrinsic motivation, we have a desire to perform a behavior for its own sake, not because we're being rewarded. Okay, in one study, kids were promised a monetary reward for playing with an interesting puzzle. And these kids played with the toy less than did the unpaid kids. In another study, rewarding children with toys or candy for reading diminished the time they spent reading. It's as if they were thinking, if I have to be bribed into doing this, it's not worth doing for its own sake. Okay, extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is the desire to perform a behavior because a person's been promised rewards or they've been threatened with punishment. Skinner believed that there were not biological constraints in operant conditioning. But Marion Breedlin, and her husband Keller Breedlin showed that animals do have biological constraints. They can be taught various behaviors, but eventually they revert back to instinct, and they called this instinctual drift. And so if you've seen any reruns of Green Acres on TV, there's a pig in the show, Arnold the pig. And they trained the pig to put coins in a piggy bank. But once the pig reached young adulthood, it ceased to do the behavior it was reinforced to do, and it would put its snout in the dirt the way pigs instinctively do. So they would need to get a younger pig, condition that pig, who would put the coins, in a piggy bank. Okay, they also tried to train raccoons to put coins in a box, but what the raccoons started to do was rub the coins together in a dipping motion, like they would bend over as if they were dipping the coin in a stream, and then they would bring their paws up, rub the coin, and then go back down to the box. And this was behavior that was similar to cleaning their food in a stream. So instead, they taught raccoons how to put a basket, or a ball, in a basketball hoop. You'll see that on the next slide. So instinctual drift. You saw on the previous two slides some applications of operant conditioning, and this slide talks about operant conditioning at home. So when we reinforce children for good behaviors, these behaviors increase in frequency. And one of the best strategies is ignoring unwanted behavior. Okay, we only punish if absolutely necessary. So ignoring unwanted behavior can decrease the occurrence of that behavior. So what I'd like you to do, instead of my giving you more examples of the applications of operant conditioning, is think of 3 different examples of operant conditioning in everyday life, and you'll bring those to class discussion. So you know now that we observe in three major ways. We learn by association through classical and operant conditioning, and we also learn by observation. So higher animals, especially humans, learn through observing and imitating others. And so you see on the slide, the monkey on the right imitates the monkey on the left and touching the pictures in a certain order to obtain a reward. Neuroscientists have discovered mirror neurons in the brains of animals and humans that are active during observational learning. These are the areas that are lit up in the slide. The brain's mirroring of another person's action may enable imitation and empathy. It's thought that it's possible that those people lacking empathy may have a deficit in motor neurons. A human's tendency to learn by way of observation is so strong that kids between the ages of 2 and 5 oftentimes over-imitate. They often copy irrelevant actions, maybe something silly. So humans have brains that support empathy and imitation. There is some controversy among neuroscientists that this imitation and empathy may not be due to mirror neurons, but by more widely distributed brain networks. But either way, kids' brains allow for empathy and their ability to infer another's mental state. Our faces often mirror another's emotional state. We yawn when someone else yawns. We laugh when someone else laughs. In one study, they put married couples in fMRI scanners, functional MRI scanners. And one person of the couple had significant pain. And when they put the people in the fMRI scanners, both people in the couple had the same brain areas activated that would account for pain. So it appears that the partner of the person in pain was empathic and the brain was activated in the same area. Children learn by observation at an early age. You see on the slide a 14-month-old child imitating the adult on television in pulling a toy apart. Albert Bandura, whose picture you see on this slide, is famous for his Bobo doll studies. Bobo doll is an inflatable punching bag weighted on the bottom with sand so that when someone punches it, it pops back up. So in 1961, he was interested in investigating children's learning aggression through observation of models who were either rewarded or punished. And I'll talk in more detail about the Bobo doll study in the chapter on social psychology. But the bottom line in Bandura's experiments was that children who saw adults rewarded for aggressive behavior were more aggressive than children who observed adults who were punished for aggressive behavior.